folks, and welcome to episode 13 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Thanks for being with us. Hope everyone enjoyed the Canada Day long weekend, and happy Stampede to everyone in Calgary or soon to be arriving in Calgary. Hey, don't forget to follow us and subscribe at our Substack page, robbreakenridge.ca. This podcast, of course, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Apple Music, and other podcast platforms. And we got a YouTube channel, youtube.com/Rob Breakenridge Show. So a lot to cover on this episode of the podcast. Two interviews for you, both on a topic that is dominating a lot of conversation in Alberta these days, separation. Will Albertans be voting an independence referendum? And how much support actually exists for separation? Now, there's actually been an interesting development on this front, which we'll get into in a bit here. Now, it's separatist forces, obviously, who are trying to force a referendum on this issue and convince enough Albertans to hop on their bandwagon. But it's actually a pro-Canada group that's beat them to the petition punch, so to speak. Elections Alberta has officially approved a petition from the group Forever Canadian. They want the referendum question, this group that is, to be, do you agree that Alberta should remain in Canada? So that kind of flips the yes-no dynamic. Now, if their petition gets enough signatures and that vote happens, that would be it. Right? There can't be a second petition and a second referendum on the same issue. So we'll hear shortly from Thomas Lukaszuk. He's a former MLA and cabinet minister in Alberta and one of the founders of this group, Forever Canadian. Now, meanwhile, a new analysis from the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy cautions against dismissing separatist sentiment in Alberta. We'll hear later on from Foundation President Mark Milke on what kind of support exists for separation, what's driving it, and why it should all be taken seriously. But some news to get to off the top here. It's actually been a really busy week in what would normally be a very quiet summer season, and a weird bit of drama that kicked off a week ago with a social media post from U.S. President Donald Trump. Now, we all want this stupid, pointless trade war and tariff drama to be over. There have been some encouraging signs lately that maybe we're getting close to some sort of trade agreement with the U.S. And then suddenly Trump announced that trade talks were off because of Canada's digital services tax. Now, I got a piece up at our Substack page, again, robbreakenridge.ca, that goes into greater detail on all of this, but here's kind of the condensed version. So Canada announced this tax way back in 2020, and it's not unlike their other attempts to squeeze money out of big tech, like they tried with the Online News Act and the Online Streaming Act. Now, those two bills turned into two big messes, especially the former. The Online News Act that led to Meta dropping Canadian news altogether rather than pay up to Ottawa. Now, other countries had considered or had implemented similar digital services taxes, but of course the U.S. felt singled out, targeted, and for good reason. Now, there was a push then to come up with some kind of an international consensus on how to deal with this issue, and OECD countries actually agreed to a moratorium, which Canada originally went along with. And then in 2023, when that moratorium was extended, Prime Minister Trudeau decided we would just go ahead and implement our tax anyway. So the legislation to do that finally passed last year. June 30th, 2025 is when that tax was to have taken effect. And the Americans, of course, were predictably upset. And that goes back to the Biden administration, by the way. And we knew this was going to lead to some sort of reaction or retaliation from the Americans, and yet we pressed ahead. We also knew that this would mean a cost to Canadian businesses, and indeed, last year, Google announced an advertising surcharge for Canadian businesses because of this tax, and still we pressed ahead. And then suddenly, over the weekend, just as the tax was to officially take effect, after all the drama of the last couple of years, poof, it's gone. Trump dropped this threat, and we dropped the tax. Just as well, perhaps, so this is a crazy way of going about it. So did we cave? Well, it sure looks like it. And more to the point, it sure looks like it to the Americans, as articulated here by White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt.
It's very simple. Prime Minister Carney in Canada caved to President Trump in the United States of America. And President Trump knows how to negotiate, and he knows that he is governing the best country and the best economy in this world, on this planet. And every country on the planet needs to have good trade relationships with the United States. And it was a mistake for Canada to vow to implement that tax that would have hurt our tech companies here in the United States. The president made his position quite clear to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister called the president last night to let the president know that he would be dropping that tax, which is a big victory for our tech companies and our American workers here at home.
Now, for his part, here was Prime Minister Mark Carney the following day explaining where things are at.
We have, to be clear, it's part of a bigger negotiation. It's something that we expected in the broader sense that would be part of a final deal. We're making progress towards a final deal. There's more to be done, to be clear. And as I just said, which answers the translation question, as I just said, is a question of timing in terms of the date for the final negotiations and when the tax was coming into effect. And, you know, it doesn't make sense to collect tax from people and then remit them back. So it provides some certainty. And as I just said, the negotiations have restarted. We're going to focus on getting the best deal for Canadians. We're making progress. There's more to do, and we'll keep you updated.
Now, again, it's all very weird. Did we think the Americans would not notice the tax coming into force, so they just wouldn't care, wouldn't respond? Was Carney happy to get rid of another of Trudeau's taxes? And if so, why didn't he announce it sooner or explain to Canadians why we needed to go in a different direction on this policy issue? Now, if Trump feels like he got his way on this, why wouldn't he try the same approach on other issues, perhaps most obviously on supply management? Of course, we've taken a strategically stupid approach on that issue too, taking something that's an obvious trade irritant to the Americans, not to mention other trading partners, and passing a law that says supply management is officially off the table in any trade negotiations. How do we think that's going to go over? Again, with supply management, it's something that's long overdue for reform. That shouldn't happen because of some angry Truth Social post or threat from Donald Trump. So we'll see how things play out from here, hopefully with a lot more progress and a lot less drama. Now, Mark Carney has tried to convince Canadians that he's the man to navigate all of this, and I guess enough Canadians bought into that in the last election. But this was not a stellar week for the federal government on this file. All right, coming up in a moment, some news from this week here in Alberta, and we'll delve into the separation conversation on a couple of fronts. You're listening to The Rob Breakenridge Show. Welcome back. So it was also an interesting and newsworthy week here in Alberta on a few different fronts. I alluded to the separation referendum petition, and we'll get to that shortly. Now, the Premier did comment on that, as well as these other big stories this week, because she was at a news conference this week making an announcement on one of them. Alberta is now one step closer to having a provincial police force. The Premier this week announced the new Alberta Sheriff's Police Service, which will be headquartered in Calgary. She says it's not meant to entirely replace the RCMP when it comes to community policing, but can provide support and also, crucially, be an option for municipalities that want to move away from having the RCMP be responsible for community policing. Now, many municipalities that rely on the RCMP are leery about ending that relationship because of that additional subsidy they receive from Ottawa to cover policing costs. Now, look, this may have to be dealt with eventually if Ottawa decides to refocus the RCMP and move it away from community policing. And in fact, it might make a lot of sense to just have the RCMP almost be like the Canadian version of the FBI. And this is not an Alberta-specific issue either. Other provinces and jurisdictions are grappling with these questions. But what makes it uniquely Albertan is the whole autonomy and sovereignty agenda of the Premier. As much as Danielle Smith has talked about the need for greater autonomy for Alberta, she hasn't been able to convince Albertans to go along with her on some of these issues. Like, for example, Alberta could set up its own pension plan and leave the CPP, but clearly people aren't crazy about that. Alberta could set up its own revenue agency, like Quebec has, but that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars and would mean we'd have two separate tax forms as Alberta taxpayers. That's a hard sell, to say the least. So creating an Alberta provincial police force might be the best starting point from that perspective, even if some of these municipal governments in rural areas aren't crazy about it. And the Premier believes her base likes the idea, and really it's a moot point to voters in Calgary and Edmonton and other urban centers that already have their own municipal police services. But the Premier insists that this is all about policing and not about politics.
I would say that what this is about is getting good policing for those areas that are currently being policed by the RCMP. As we mentioned, there's 80% of people who already have a local police service, a municipal force, but we have vacancies that have resulted in a delay in response time, sometimes for days, sometimes issues not getting followed up on at all. And that's not delivering good policing. That's what this is about, is to fill some of those gaps, which we've already done. We have a scan force under the sheriffs, which shuts down drug houses. We've got a surveillance team. We've got a fugitive apprehension team. We've got a border security team. And many of those entities work hand in glove with Alert, with municipal forces, and even with the RCMP. I think that I'm just mindful that the federal government issued a white paper saying that they think that the role of the RCMP should change. And so that means that we've got to ensure that we don't have any gaps. That's what this is about, is making sure our rural communities get the response time that they deserve.
Okay, so some comments there regarding the future of policing in Alberta from the Premier. Now, another intriguing bit of news this week concerns a pair of outcasts from the UCP caucus and plans to start a new party, or rather, to revive an old party. Independent MLAs Peter Guthrie and Scott Sinclair announced this week their intention to bring back the old PC Party banner. Now, both have been elected as UCP MLAs, and both were recently kicked out of caucus. Guthrie, in fact, had been an early supporter of Danielle Smith and had served in her cabinet. His sin was to call on the government to hold a public inquiry into this whole controversy around healthcare contracts and procurement. For his part, Sinclair got the boot after voting against the budget. He felt the budget ignored rural Alberta at the expense of the two big cities. Now, the two say that under Danielle Smith, the UCP has become too unaccountable on these and other issues, and also too separatist-friendly. They believe there's an appetite for a more moderate, conservative, and patriotic Canadian alternative. Now, of course, the PC Party has some historical baggage itself. Now, the UCP, as you no doubt recall, was created through a merger of the Wild Rose Party and the old PC Party. Now, Sinclair and Guthrie argue that the UCP has let their claim on that name lapse, and it's now fair game for a new party. Danielle Smith, on the other hand, insists that the name is still off limits for anyone else.
Well, as I mentioned, it's in elections law. It was my predecessor who passed that, saying that the name of the former legacy parties of the UCP could not be registered as new parties, and that is so that we do not have confusion for voters. And so we're going to raise that with the elections officials and remind them that that's what the law says, and we would expect that the law will be followed. What I would say is that we have always had multiple parties on the ballot. Even last time around, if you go and look at the number of parties that were on the ballot, I think there were 4 or 5 or 6 different conservative parties that were listed there. And I think our success demonstrated that people like the United Conservative Party. They like what we stand for. They like what we're doing. They want to vote for us. They've been voting. They've supported us in record numbers. We've had the highest attendance and highest revenue-generating leaders' dinners this year. We are out fundraising the opposition NDP, I think, by 3-1. So I feel like those are the measures that I am looking at, and we'll be prepared to make our case in the next election, no matter who ends up being on the ballot.
Okay, so we'll see what comes of that dispute. It is worth noting that other parties have used the word Wild Rose in their name without issue, and it would be odd that Elections Alberta wouldn't already know what rules do or do not apply to the use of this name. But will this amount to anything, though? That's hard to say. The UCP still remains a dominant force in Alberta, both in terms of strong poll numbers and strong fundraising numbers. Now, there does appear to be some growing divide amongst conservatives stemming from the whole separation issue. And Smith herself has expressed those fears about the potential impact and vote split that could create. And no doubt the NDP would love to see a divided right once again in Alberta, although at the same time, I'm sure they would love to convince these disaffected moderate conservatives that there's room in the NDP's big tent. I'll say I got a ton of respect for both Guthrie and Sinclair for standing by their principles, being willing to pay a political price. And it's not easy to be an independent in a system where parties wield so much power and clout. Building up a new party, though, is also a huge task, and who's to say that Guthrie and Sinclair would be the final word on what this new PC party looks like or stands for, especially when you get other people, maybe even thousands of other people involved. But just when it seemed like Alberta had become firmly a two-party system, there's at least now some uncertainty on whether that will continue to be the case. We'll see how it all plays out. Now, coming up momentarily, a conversation with someone who was once prominent in the old PC party. Thomas Lukaszuk was an MLA and a cabinet minister, including serving as deputy premier. He's now involved in a group called Forever Canadian. They're trying to get a petition going to force a vote on separation, not because they want separation, but instead they want to corner and derail the separatist movement. And it's their petition that is now the first to be authorized by Elections Alberta. And by the way, here's Danielle Smith's response when asked about it this week.
I'm going to let the various processes play out. I understand that the Chief Electoral Officer affirmed the question that had been put forward by Mr. Lukaszuk, and so we'll see if he's able to get the requisite number of signatures. I gather he submitted it under the old rules, so I think he needs 293,000 signatures, so I'll wait and see if he's able to accomplish that.
So it will be interesting to see which petition threshold this group will be expected to meet, right? There's the original legislation, and then there's the lower threshold that the Premier has brought in. And obviously, we'll all be watching closely to see whether they can meet that threshold. Anyway, we'll find out more in just a second when we're joined by Mr. Lukaszuk. You're listening to The Rob Breakenridge Show. Very interesting development concerning a very important question Albertans are grappling with at the moment, our place in Canada, the future of our place in Canada, and whether we'll be casting votes in a referendum to address that question. Elections Alberta, that is, has accepted a petition, a citizens' initiative petition. The interesting wrinkle here is that this is not from a pro-separatist group, quite the opposite, in fact. Very pleased to welcome to the program here today Thomas Lukaszuk, now former MLA, cabinet minister, deputy premier of Alberta, representing a group called Forever Canadian, and it's their petition that's been accepted. So joining us for more is the aforementioned Thomas Lukaszuk. Thomas, great to have you with us here.
Rob, thank you for having me.
So let's back up a bit before we find out what this all means here now. But how did this all come about? You've been working on this for a little while now.
Well, I've been working on the legal aspect for a little while, so there was a lot of work behind the scenes. You know, this Forever Canadian group, it's just not myself, obviously. I have been fortunate enough to pull in a large number of legal counsel and former politicians, both federal and provincial, from every political party under the sun. So we have been working on this for a while. But ultimately, the most important step was filing a question with Elections Alberta that both complies with this Alberta legislation for citizen initiatives, but also that complies with federal constitutional requirements and with the reference decision of Supreme Court of Canada. So we have devised a question that complies. Elections Alberta agreed, hence they certified our question, and we can proceed with a petition and then possibly a referendum.
So what motivated you to do this?
Well, number one, personal passion. You know, I immigrated to this country as a 12-year-old and as a refugee from Poland. And I have to tell you, there isn't a day, and I've been living in Canada now for almost 45 years, but there isn't a day that I'm not thankful to Canada. And I think when I say that, I speak on behalf of all immigrants who were not fortunate enough to be born in Canada. But also, I'm of the opinion that if there is going to be a conversation about the future of Canada, because that's what it is, that conversation should be led by individuals who actually care about the future of Canada as a whole, and that will lead this conversation based on facts and laws and not based on disinformation, which we are seeing a lot of, not only from the group of separatists, but unfortunately from our premier as well.
I think there are those who would just rather not bother with any of this. Like, there are people who don't want to see a referendum. But was it your concern that we were going to get one anyway, and it was all about shaping that question?
That is correct, because as we know, very recently, Premier Danielle Smith has passed a bill, Bill 54, which amended the Citizens Initiatives Act, making it much easier for separatists to force a plebiscite, a referendum, lowering the number of signatures that are required to force a referendum, extending the period of time during which they could collect signatures. And surprisingly enough, this referendum will be proclaimed on American Independence Day, July 4. So it was inevitable to have this conversation and to have a referendum. So instead of having them, the separatists, lead this campaign, I decided that it should be the other way around.
So what would the question be under this petition?
Should Alberta remain in Canada? It's that
Right, so
simple.
yes.
It's a binary, and the answer is yes, and it's a binary question. It's a yes or a no question. And we will, not only through our website, but throughout this entire campaign, we will be putting forward facts, legal, economic facts, and also speaking to the fact that in reality, there isn't really a clear pathway for Alberta to unilaterally separate from Canada anyhow. But the rhetoric, this conversation about separating, frankly, is more dangerous than the prospect of separating itself. We saw what happened in Quebec during their referendum. Business and investment literally dried up in Quebec. There is a reason why Bank of Montreal has its headquarters right now in Toronto. Because they moved. We saw what happened with Brexit. We saw what's happening, or we see every day what's happening in the Basque region of Spain. So that conversation of separation is not healthy for Alberta, and it's not healthy for all of Canada. Also, Rob, I don't think I need to convince anybody that we live in rather unprecedented, turbulent times from a geopolitical perspective. And this is the time where our federal government, and I don't care who is in government, which political party, but our federal government has to be focused on dealing with the United States and particularly President Trump, dealing with the European Union, forging new alliances, new trade agreements, and having this instability, this destruction within Canada is not helpful at all. So if we are to have a united front abroad, we need to be united in Canada. And last, Rob, but not least, and I'm actually quite concerned about it, we saw what happened in Quebec during the FLQ crisis. And I imagine that those who were spearheading this pro-separatist movement never anticipated that it will actually end up in tragedies, in kidnappings and assassinations. But unfortunately, the anger that is usually associated with breaking away, that is fed by politicians and pro-separatists, can get out of control. And I'm hoping that having this campaign and this petition led by facts in a rational way will perhaps avoid some of the unintended
I think there
consequences.
is frustration, maybe not necessarily anger, but I think there's discontent, there's frustration, and there long has been in Alberta.
Sure.
The perception maybe that we don't matter, our concerns have been ignored, and I think separatists take that one step further, that we'd be better off on our own. But where do you think that frustration comes from then?
And I don't question that frustration. They don't need me to validate it. If people feel frustrated, then obviously they are frustrated. Now, whether this frustration is based on facts or disinformation, actually for decades, and that includes even the time period when I was in government for almost 15 years, where Albertans are actually told that they should be frustrated and not shown the whole picture of what the relationship between provinces in Canada looks like. That's part of it. And part of my campaign will be actually demystifying some of those issues. And hopefully some individuals will have a little bit of an aha moment saying, you know what, even though I don't like it, but now I know why it is the way it is, and it actually makes sense. So that will be part of this, calm, rational conversation. But, we as politicians have often used this discontent for political gain. I can tell you, I was in the progressive conservative government for 15 years, and we always hated when there was a conservative government in Ottawa, because we couldn't quite overtly beat up on him. We had to sort of play nice. It is much easier to run for office and to govern Alberta when you can virtually blame everything on Ottawa and particularly on Quebec and Ontario. And maybe that has become part of our culture, and that's fine. And the Premier of Alberta, no matter who it is, has every right to negotiate better deals with Ottawa, with other provinces. But that has to be done in good faith. I find it unacceptable for any province, as much as I found it unacceptable for Quebec, to hold a proverbial gun to the rest of Canada's head and saying, look, we want it our way or we're separating. And my referendum and my campaign hopefully will take that proverbial gun away from Danielle Smith, forcing her to, A, focus on provincial issues, and also sit down at the table with Prime Minister Carney or other premiers and negotiate deals in good faith.
Yeah, the Premier says she's not a separatist, right? The Premier says that she's just trying to get a better deal for Alberta. She wants to take the wind out of the sails of this separatist movement. But what are your thoughts on how she's been handling all of this?
Well, you know what? I don't accept the Premier's statement that she's not a separatist. If she truly was not a separatist, why would she amend the Citizens Initiative Act for the separatists to make it easier for them to force her? She should actually make it even harder for them. She wouldn't be proclaiming this bill on American Independence Day. She could have chosen any other day sooner, day after. But she's sending messages. She has a political problem. She has at least 14 MLAs, some of whom are cabinet ministers, who are overtly either pro-separatist or at least considering separatism as a viable option. And even though there truly is a small percentage of Albertans who seriously consider separatism, in her party, in UCP, that percentage is significantly higher. And she cannot lose more than 5 to 10% of popular support within her party because she will lose seats in the next election. So she's dancing this very awkward dance where she wants to say, I'm not a separatist, but she's doing everything to empower separatists to achieve their goal. I sort of think about this like a Pontius Pilate approach. Here are all the knives and daggers, but leave me out of it. I'm washing my hands. She also devised this very strange phrase, sovereign Alberta within United Canada. Well, that is a word salad. It means nothing. It has no legal basis. That is, Rob, almost like me saying that I am single within the confines of my marriage. It's a statement that sort of tries to appease both sides. And I'm hoping that, again, this initiative that I'm leading will force our Premier to take a clear position. Either she is pro-separatist, which many of her actions, including her panel that she's tracked right now, and if you look at the website that she put together, clearly is leading those who participate in this questionnaire towards answering in a manner that would suggest that some form of separation from at least Canadian programs like RCMP, Canada Pension Plan, and others is something that Albertans want. Or she declares that she is against any form of separation and will continue to dialogue with other provinces and with our federal government in good faith.
There's some significance in being first, and the fact that your petition has been accepted. What does this mean for any other petition efforts?
There won't be any other. The act is very clear that the first petition, the application for petition that is filed with Elections Alberta, will be reviewed first. They are reviewed in the order in which they were filed. And since mine was filed first, it was reviewed and approved, which, according to the legislation, that means that there cannot be any other petition or referendum on the same or similar question. So any question that pertains to Alberta's separation from Canada cannot proceed, because that would, naturally be very confusing to Albertans if they had two competing petitions. So no, the fact that I filed first precludes this question from being asked again for at least 5 years.
But if your petition fails to garner the needed signatures, we would kind of reset back to zero and another petition could proceed.
Then another petition would have to be filed. So, the pro-separatists have a double problem. As the sort of the funny saying says, you had one job. And they've been touring the province having town hall meetings with their question, but one thing they didn't do is file the question. Which sort of makes me wonder if you're trying to start a new country and you want to govern a new country and you can't even figure out when and how to file a petition, that should leave Albertans with something to wonder about. But the fact is that since they didn't file a petition, they can't proceed. But the second problem that they have is that the question that they are actually proposing, in the minds of most legal scholars, cannot be asked, cannot be accepted by Elections Alberta, because it is ultra-virus to our Canadian Constitution. It basically contradicts our Canadian Constitution for two reasons. We have a Supreme Court of Canada reference decision relevant to what and how questions need to be asked for referenda. But second of all, their question does not at all consider, it actually disregards any rights garnered by our First Nations under the First Nations treaties, which were signed directly with the Crown, with Buckingham Palace. So I find it rather unlikely that even if they were to be first to file the petition, that their question could be considered.
Now, there's an interesting question, too, regarding your petition effort, because we have the original Citizens Initiative legislation. As you mentioned, the Premier changed it to lower the threshold. What's the threshold that you're operating under?
You know what? We honestly don't know at this point in time, because on July 4, the Premier is proclaiming the Amendment Act, which technically lowers the number of signatures, prolongs the time, and also really relaxes fundraising rules. That was another gift that she was intending to give the separatists. But she never anticipated, I imagine, that someone like me will actually use this legislation for the opposite reason. So now Elections Alberta will have to determine whether I will have to carry on under the old rules, which would mean that I have to garner 10% of eligible voters in Alberta signatures. So that would roughly be about 300,000 signatures in 90 days. Or will the new rules apply to me, which would mean that I would have to garner 170,000 signatures in 120 days. I am of the opinion, that's right, I am of the opinion that Premier fully intended to make it easier on separatists, and she will have no issue with allowing us to benefit from the same rules, but we shall see. But Rob, I am not worried about the number of signatures. I can tell you, judging by the reaction that there is. I went to a baseball game yesterday in Edmonton, and you wouldn't believe how many people just came up and said, "Good on you. Where can I sign? How can I volunteer?" Albertans were looking for something positive to latch onto. I think Albertans are tired from being told how unhappy they should be. And this is a venue to show some positivity, and this is a venue where we can show our commitment to Canada. So the number of signatures should not be a problem.
So how do you go about doing it? And I guess for people listening or watching, how do they get involved?
Okay, so now Elections Alberta is trying to figure out the rules. They're sort of in a way building an airplane while flying it. They approved my question, but they don't have the rules yet. They're waiting for this amendment to be proclaimed on July 4. So once they do it, they will set up the rules, and I will have 30 days to appoint a chief financial officer, because this campaign has to be transparent and reconciled with Elections Alberta. The moment I appoint a chief financial officer, then the clock starts ticking on collecting signatures, either 90 days or 120 days. That remains to be seen. We, within the next few days, will be launching our website. We already have, signed up volunteers, I would say virtually in every municipality, town across Alberta. And then we go off to work. So if anybody wants to volunteer and collect signatures, all they need to do is contact me on social media, pretty soon on our website, register themselves. They have to be registered with Elections Alberta. Only registered volunteers get to collect signatures, and it's the old-fashioned paper and pens petition. It is not an online petition.
Now, I guess the other question too: if this succeeds, when would this vote occur, or is that at the discretion of the premier?
It is, but the premier will have two choices, and I think neither one of which she will like. Because either A, she has to have this question as a referendum question at the next election, not necessarily provincial. It could be municipal elections. So it could be as early as October if our clock runs out before that time. Or she has an option number two. She can take it to the legislature and have all MLAs in the legislature vote on it. And if they vote in favor of Alberta staying in Canada, then that will become the official policy of government of Alberta, which, as I said, Rob, earlier, it sort of takes away that proverbial gun or the wind in her sails, using separation as a leverage in her negotiations with other provinces and with Canadian government.
Okay, very interesting. Well, Thomas, we'll see how this all plays out in the days and weeks ahead. Thank you so much for making some time for us here today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Rob. I really appreciate it too.
Okay, so there you go. Once again, Thomas Lukaszuk, former Alberta MLA and cabinet minister, now speaking on behalf of the group Forever Canadian, looking to, I guess, beat the separatists at their own game, to do the petition thing, to force a referendum, but to be in control of the question. So that's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. Now, here's the thing. I mean, even if you get that wording, which is perhaps more favorable to the Canada cause, as it were, it's still a referendum. We're still voting on a pretty big question and voting on whether to remain a part of the country. So how much separatist sentiment is out there? Right? How real is this threat? There's an interesting new analysis from the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy. It says it's maybe stronger than you might think, or at least it would be a mistake to dismiss support for separatism, and that we should be paying attention to that frustration and discontent in Alberta. So we'll find out more about that in just a second. We'll be joined by Mark Milke, president at the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy. This is the Rob Breakenridge Show. Well, it's pretty clear that in the aftermath of the recent federal election, there's been a lot of conversation about Alberta separatism, and it seems like an upsurge in support for the idea of Alberta separatism. It also feels like there's some inevitability to the idea that we're going to be voting in a referendum on that question at some point in the future. But how much support is there for Alberta separatism? How seriously should we take it, both here in Alberta and across the country? Well, a new analysis from the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy says it would be a mistake to dismiss Western frustrations, and by extension, it would be a mistake to dismiss the idea or support for the idea of Alberta separatism. You can read more at aristotlefoundation.org. Joining us for more is Mark Milke. He is president and founder of the Aristotle Foundation. Mark, great to have you with us here.
Thanks for having me on, Rob.
First of all, I mean, we see the talk, we see different polls. How do we really know for sure kind of where Albertans are at on this question, first of all?
Well, I suppose it's like any election. You never really know the results until they're in. But what we tried to do in this comparison of polls over the last couple of months was show a range in the Western provinces from Manitoba to British Columbia and Saskatchewan, Alberta in between, of course. And also make a comparison to Quebec in the 1970s and more recently. So, and part of the reason for the study is, look, I understand Western frustration as much as anybody else. I've written a lot of studies on equalization, the problem with federal transfer programs. I was the head of research for the War Room, the Energy War Room. We did a lot of work out of that research department trying to explain to the rest of the country why oil and gas and why energy matters and why they shouldn't be hindering it. And I'm a born and raised Westerner. I was born in British Columbia, born and raised there. Spent a lot of my career and life here in Alberta, where I'm at now in Calgary. So I get Western frustrations as much as anyone. And in fact, I've done a lot to try and alert the rest of the country to this. So we decided to write this particular brief for the Aristotle Foundation, though, on the polls to basically say to the rest of the country, if you just look at the polls now as a snapshot in time and you want to underestimate the populist fervor out here is perhaps the best way to put it, as some did in response to Preston Manning about 2 months ago, then I think that's a great mistake. What the polls show, if you look at various polls, that, Manitoba doesn't seem to be a lot of interest there. I think it was like 8 to 12% or something, the range of possible separatist inclinations in that province. But on the high end, in Alberta and Saskatchewan, you're looking at 36, 33%, British Columbia, 20%. Now, one can poo-poo that and say, yeah, well, that's not going to get you across the finish line. And I say this, by the way, as a non-separatist. We started the Aristotle Foundation to try and do public policy in Canada and some issues that I thought needed to be done, including Canadian history, appreciating Canadian history. So I come at this from a non-separatist perspective. Nonetheless, again, as much as anyone, I think I understand why we're frustrated out here, and there are legitimate complaints and grievances. So, but what you see is, if you see 33 or 36%, what people may not know is Quebec right now, its separatist sentiment is only 30%. But let's go back to the 1970s. And you find that in 1976, the Parti Québécois and René Lévesque, the man who would become premier, head of the Parti Québécois, got elected in that province with just under 41%. 40% voted for separation in the 1980 referendum, on and on. So I would caution those outside of the West, or even the West, who think that this is a non-issue, that may be incorrect.
Right. And I think that's a fair point, because it is unpredictable in terms of where this is all going. And I do wonder if there's a dismissal of those concerns because the numbers perceived to be low, whether that ends up almost exacerbating the situation here.
I think so. Look, when I read stuff in the Toronto Star from David Olive, one of their columnists, business columnists, saying, Alberta's giving me a headache, it was pretty condescending. And he talks about the amount of money that the federal government spent on the TMX pipeline, $34 billion, and says, shouldn't you, Albertans in particular, not the other three Western provinces, I guess, shouldn't you Albertans be grateful? No, because if you understand the history of TMX, Kinder Morgan was going to get that pipeline done on its own. And then Justin Trudeau came in as prime minister, and Stephen Gibault and the rest of them, and really made it difficult, started to cancel pipelines like Northern Gateway, which had already been approved, so on and so forth. So someone with an understanding of the West, i.e. often those here, but even someone in Toronto or Montreal or the rest of the country who understands that issue, would understand that the federal government stepped in, spent a truckload of money they didn't have to if they hadn't been so anti-oil pipeline down to their genes. So, so when you see someone from Toronto poo-poo the notion of Western separatism, they also misunderstand the context. There's a great long historical context in the West, which maybe in central Canada some are unaware of, which is that it took decades after Confederation for Saskatchewan and Alberta and Manitoba to get resource rights that other provinces had at Confederation or when they joined. 5 decades after that happened, in the early 1930s, you had the National Energy Program in the West, which of course was akin to, and for those who don't know it, refresh their memory, if I recall the percentages, it would basically force Western energy companies to sell their oil domestically, at least, at 85% of the world price. That's like telling Ontario automakers to sell their cars at 85% of the world price, or what they think they could get domestically. So there was that. And then what did you get in response? Well, Brian Mulroney comes in with a progressive conservative government, gets rid of that and some other bad policy, flips on some other stuff, makes life difficult for the West on CF18, the rise of the Reform Party. I could go on. But you've had these attempts, including the positive input of the Reform Party, Preston Manning, the West wants in, and then you get that, and then the Harper government, which still has difficulty getting pipelines done because of some opposition in places like Quebec. I mean, I could go into great detail, but those of us in the West are kind of aware of those policy decisions over 5 decades or a century. And if you live maybe not in the West and you don't understand that, then you don't understand the frustration and other issues. I mean, the historic ones, pre and post Confederation, farmers and Eastern banks and this sort of thing, which may not, exactly rile people today. But there's a history of the West being treated like a colonial outpost because it was. And I think there's a different, animus now in that in Western Canada, what animates separatism is this notion that you've got, and it's not the first time, you've got some Quebec politicians that have too great input into what's a federal or what's a provincial, jurisdiction, resources. And, so on and on. And so this is why I think Central Canada doesn't get it. But also, this is the other difference. And one of the differences we point out in this Aristotle Foundation study on polling in Western separatism. For those with a good memory, and again, I have one because I'm from British Columbia, you may recall, I'm sure you recall, Rob, the 1992 Charlottetown Accord, where all of us could vote on the referendum or the package of constitutional proposals. And British Columbia, though, rejected that package of constitutional proposals by 68%. That was the no vote. It was 60% in Alberta. I think it was about 56% in Quebec. Why did British Columbians overwhelmingly reject that constitutional proposal that would have brought Quebec in? It's because it was giving Quebec special status, along with some other groups. And growing up in British Columbia, there's nothing we hated more than seeing Quebec be treated with, a special status. And so I think, even if separation is only at 20% today, if the federal government does something that is against British Columbia's interests, for example, and you don't know what it would be in advance necessarily, you could see separatism, or at least anti-Ottawa sentiment ramp up. And so I think it's a mistake, again, for people to look at the polls as static. Just 20% in British Columbia might favor separatism. Right. Or 36% of British Columbia, or Alberta rather. Yeah, but what happens if you get a dynamic leader? What happens if some issue arises that makes British Columbians feel that they're annoyed by Ottawa and separatism ramps up? So I would look at some of the numbers you've seen in polls, Rob, and others have seen in polls as a potential floor, not necessarily a ceiling.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, in terms of some of the differences between Alberta and Quebec, I mean, it's often noted that, in Quebec you have right-wing separatists, you have left-wing separatists. Like it's less political maybe, or partisan in that sense. Here in Alberta, it seems like support for separatism falls pretty much exclusively on what we would call the right. I mean, A, is it fair to say that? And B, to what extent does that matter?
Yeah, I don't think it matters a whole lot. I mean, I think you're right. It's more cultural in Quebec, of course, so it can span left and right. Left and right are not great terms to describe something, but for lack of a better, description, sure, you got people all over the ideological and political spectrum. And in the West, it's more, in Alberta, now Saskatchewan, increasingly it's more economic, but it's not just that. It's a sense that we've tried. The West has tried for a very long time to make the best of 1867 institutional style frameworks, really, for the Constitution, right? Whether it's Parliament guaranteeing, or a certain number of seats in the Senate rather being guaranteed to places like PEI, in Quebec, or other things that we have to put up with in terms of the federal transfer payment program, where basically for a long time it's been Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia. When you do the net calculations that contribute into the pot, the other provinces take out on a net basis. And even some provinces in the West. But maybe the best way to explain it is, I think after a number of attempts to kind of correct the deficiencies out there in the constitutional framework or political framework, and without being partisan about the last election, you see a party come back in that for the last 10 years made it really difficult, if not impossible, to develop resource projects in the country from Justin Trudeau downward. Then, I talked to a CEO who best illustrates this problem before the election, who said, look, 5 years ago, separatism was a fringe thing. But he sat around at a dinner one night with 20 CEOs. 18 would vote for separatism these days. And it's not because they're radicals. It's because they're like, listen, they can go down to the United States and do business. They can't here. And so eventually you just go, why? Right? Now, again, I'm not endorsing that. I think we'll muddle through somehow. But on the other hand, this paper was written less with Westerners in mind, more to Central Canadians and Atlantic Canadians, to say, if you ignore these things, keep in mind in Quebec, when Quebec separatists think about voting for separatism, what do they have to consider if they know the numbers? How are you going to pay your bills, right? Because Quebec gets $13 billion from equalization alone. But in the West, in Alberta and British Columbia, especially in Alberta, some Albertans might be tempted to vote for separation because they think, I don't like all this money being, funneled through the federal government, which then makes it difficult for us to do business here. Or going to Quebec, which has politicians, not the public. The public actually favors pipelines in Quebec, at least a plurality does. But they look over there and go, really, another Quebec politician telling us what we cannot do with their own resources, which is a constitutional right of the provinces across the country. So I think, again, if one is in the rest of the country looking at the West and poo-pooing this sentiment, yeah, that probably inflames it. But I think it's actually, I fully understand why some people would vote for separatism, because they're like, we've tried every other way, electing different political parties, like in the 1980s, having our own independent political party in the 1980s, being nice to the rest of the country, cajoling, and then we still can't get stuff done. So that will drive separatism, especially when you're a wealthy part of the country. That can sometimes drive separatism more than if you're a poor part of the country. The same dynamic exists in Spain, by the way. Basque separatism, the north part of the country, around Catalonia, around Barcelona, that's one of the richer parts of Spain, not the south. And so sometimes you get the richer part of the country going, I don't like how we're being treated, we're gone. Not endorsing it. I'm just saying people want to understand the dynamics behind potential separatist sentiment. Don't overlook that, because that's a powerful one. Unlike Quebec, where who's going to pay for your wonderful social programs and everything else you like to do in Quebec?
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, because that's part of the sense here. It's like, well, we could do it on our own. We could be fine on our own. And I think that's a different question, because by the same token, I think those that would be frustrated with Alberta, those that you referred to, they sort of look at Alberta and say, well, what other provinces thrive more than Alberta? What are you complaining about?
Well, and of course, and to begin with, this is where history matters. One of the reasons we set up the Aristotle Foundation is to introduce some history into these arguments. Right. Those of us here in 2014 understand what happened when the oil price collapsed. It was pretty devastating. And basically, Alberta went through a 5-year recession. And some of us tried to help the province out of that. I was on the campaign committee for Jason Kenney. We sat around a boardroom trying to figure out what should the policy be in the 2019 election. One of the things we did was drop the corporate tax rate from 12 to 8, try and diversify the economy, attract all sorts of investment. Frankly, it worked. But if you know your history in terms of the oil prices, oil starts to come back, 2016? Lots of investment goes south to the Americans, not to Alberta. And so people here are suffering during that period. And I gave a speech once to explorers, an Explorers Association, geological, well, they were engineers, but also, I forget the exact term, but basically those who were on the front lines of exploring for new finds. Half of their membership was unemployed in 2016 when I talked to them. So people here know that, they have that memory, and they understand that investment did go to the rest of the world. It revived pretty quickly in the United States, unlike Canada. And so for other Canadians to say, yeah, well, you're wealthy. Yeah, but no thanks to, again, some politicians in some parts of the country trying to handicap what we're trying to do here, in Alberta in particular, and to a lesser degree, Saskatchewan. So yeah, that dynamic, it's not just going back 50 years to the National Energy Program or 45 years. It's like, no, we know what happened after 2015. And when you cancel the Northern Gateway pipeline, things like that send a very strong message, drop dead basically. And people here remember that. So, and while they still have some money and are wealthier than the rest of the country, they're like, yeah, they know people that are unemployed. They know there's a high unemployment right now in terms of the youth, et cetera, et cetera. And they see their kids going south. That's another dynamic we shouldn't forget in Canada. This place used to hire people kids out of high school to go make 6 figures in the oil sands and drive water trucks. That's not really as much there as it used to be. So I think for the rest of the country to understand, Albertans, and again, I've been now here since 2002, and I was a bit here in the 90s as well. So I can speak as an Albertan, but I can certainly speak as a Westerner, as both. When that dynamic is in play, one has to be very careful about saying, yeah, well, try me. You may find, people may find a lot of Albertans, if a referendum comes about, they may not be hardcore separatists in the sort of cultural nationalist sense that Quebecois were in 76 or 1980 or 1995, but they may take a risk.
Yeah. And it's interesting because Quebec has the Bloc Québécois. Quebec has the Parti Québécois, who probably formed the next government there. Alberta doesn't have that. And, we saw in the recent by-election and what would probably be a sympathetic riding, a separatist party finished third, even behind the NDP. But how much do we read into that, the difference between partisan politics and an idea?
I think very little, because first of all, what do they call themselves? The Republican Party of Alberta or something? Yeah. What a silly, to respect, what a silly title, for a political party. At the same time, Donald Trump has been attacking Canada on trade issues. So they're drinking their own bathwater, perhaps, on the name. So I don't think it tells you much, again, for the reasons I mentioned. If you're getting, sentiment that's spiking to 36%, what if you get a charismatic leader? The West has a history of charismatic leaders. Populist leaders. Tommy Douglas, in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. What about Preston Manning coming out of nowhere, in the 1980s? A bespectacled, accountant-looking type who takes a party from nothing to the official opposition based on Western frustrations and some frustrations in the rest of the country. So there is a history of populism in the West. And I come from British Columbia. I mean, one of the first populist premiers was probably W.A.C. Bennett from my hometown of Kelowna, 1952 to 1972. It's not absent in British Columbia either. I think you put the right dynamics in play and a leader that you and I don't even know about at this point, and they don't even have to be running, but they could be advocates for this cause. I mean, look around the world at populist movements. And again, I don't think populism is necessarily a bad thing. It's an expression of frustrated citizens in democracy. The means and the ends may or may not always be right, but that's not the point. The point is, if people feel they're being ignored and they find someone who carries their cause forward, Donald Trump is a pretty imperfect vehicle, but he's obviously touched into a lot of frustrations in the American psyche, in some people's minds and souls. Same thing here. What happens if a populist arises that nobody knows today, but 8 months from now, look, could be a talk show host. I mean, it could be whatever that just drives sentiment ahead.
We saw it with Brexit too, right? And these things do become unpredictable. Right. I mean, the other thing too, even if a referendum fails, if you've got 35, 40% of Albertans or in any other region of the country that upset, feeling that discontent that they would vote that way, even if it fails, technically, it's something that we should worry about, isn't it?
Yeah, because it may come back. It may disrupt investment patterns. It's a bit like starting a war. You never know how it's going to end. So, you go to war in 1914, you'll think you'll be back by Christmas, and you're still in Belgium and France, and fighting 4 years later. So so voting for separatism is no guarantee you'll get what you want either. But again, I get the internal logic of the proposals because I get the frustration living here. And again, having proposed a number of times reforms to programs like equalization and the rest of it, I'm more than aware of what's driving this, which is why I would advise the rest of the country not to underestimate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll see where it all goes from here. In the meantime, this analysis, it's up at AristotleFoundation.org. Mark Milke, thanks so much for joining us here. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Rob. Anytime.
Okay, there you go. That is Mark Milke. He is founder and president of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy, AristotleFoundation.org. Also, our thanks to Thomas Lukaszuk, former Alberta MLA and cabinet minister with the group Forever Canadian, and we'll see where their petition drive goes in the days and weeks ahead. Listen, that's going to do it for us on this edition of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Don't forget to check out our website, our Substack at robbreakenridge.ca. Have yourselves a fantastic weekend. If you're in Calgary, safe and enjoyable stampeding. We will be back with a new episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show coming up on Tuesday. Have a great weekend. So we'll talk to you then. Take care.